There is an object, no larger than a pint of milk, sitting in a dusty display case in the Aberdeen Proving Ground Museum. To the casual observer, it looks like a crude piece of industrial debris, a cone of green-painted metal, topped with a bakelite cap, housing a fragile assembly of glass vacuum tubes and copper wiring. It does not look like a weapon of mass destruction. It does not look like the arbiter of empires. But if you were to perform a forensic autopsy on the German Wehrmacht in the winter of 1944, you would find this specific object lodged in its fatal wound. This is the POZIT fuse, technically the variable time, or VT, fuse. In December 1944, strictly confidential quartermaster reports from the European theatre began to show a statistical anomaly that should have been impossible. The United States Army, a force that was allegedly surprised, overrun, and panicked by the massive German counteroffensive known as the Battle of the Bulge, was expending artillery ammunition at a rate that defied logistical logic. But the anomaly wasn't just in the expenditure, it was in the lethality. German casualty reports from the northern shoulder of the Bulge, specifically around a piece of high ground called Elsenborn Ridge, stopped mentioning combat engagements and started sounding like descriptions of natural disasters. Veteran units, men who had survived the meat grinder of the Eastern Front, were writing home, if they lived long enough to write, about a sudden, invisible annihilation. They spoke of entire battalions simply ceasing to exist in a single second. History books like to show us maps with big red arrows sweeping through the Ardennes. They talk about General Patton's race to Bastogne or the paratroopers of the 101 Airborne. Those are stories of grit and heroism. But the story of Elsenborn Ridge is not a story of heroism. It is a story of mathematics. It is a story of trigonometry applied to biology. The myth tells us that the Battle of the Bulge was stopped by the indomitable spirit of the American G1 shivering in a foxhole. The reality, the missing log we are opening today, is that the German 6th Panzer Army wasn't stopped by spirit. It was erased by a fire control algorithm known as time on target, and a secret radio set hidden inside an artillery shell that turned the forest of the Ardennes into the largest fragmentation grenade in human history. Let us open the dossier on the death of the 277th Volksgrenadier Division. To understand the slaughter that took place at Elsenborn, we have to pivot away from the romanticized image of World War II and look at the war as an industrial process. By late 1944, the Third Reich was a machine running on fumes, lubricants mixed with sand, and broken gears. But it still had teeth. The plan for Wacht am Rhein, the Watch on the Rhine, was ambitious. It required moving 200,000 men and thousands of tanks through narrow, icy roads in total radio silence to strike a weak point in the Allied line. The objective was simple: speed. They had to cross the Meuse River before the Allies could react. To do that, they needed to crack open the road network. And the key to the road network in the north lay on a high, windswept plateau known as Elsenborn Ridge. If you look at the table of organisation and equipment for the German forces assigned to this sector, particularly the ISS Panzer Corps, on paper, they look invincible. You see King Tiger tanks, Panther tanks, and the fanatical infantry of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, alongside the 277th Volksgrenadiers. But paper is not reality. The 277th was a Volksgrenadier unit, the People's Grenadiers. This was a rebranding exercise by Goebbels to disguise the fact that these were the scrapings of the manpower barrel. Many were old men, young boys, or convalescents from previous wounds. Their equipment was a logistical nightmare, a mix of captured weapons, horse-drawn carts, and a severe lack of winter clothing. Yet they were the hammer intended to smash the American line to make way for the SS Panzers. Opposing them on the ridge was the American 99th Infantry Division, green troops, untested, known as the Battle Babies. If you ran this simulation on a board game, the veterans of the German army, backed by heavy armour, should have rolled over the battle babies in 6 hours. But the Germans made a fatal calculation error. They looked at the infantry strength. They ignored the grid coordinates of the V-Corps artillery. The Americans had turned artillery into a science that rivaled the assembly lines of Detroit. While the Germans treated artillery as a support weapon, firing generally at area targets, the Americans had centralized it into a massive, unified switchboard of death. This is where the concept of time on target, or TOT, enters our investigation. TOT is not just shooting a lot of guns, it is a complex physics problem. Imagine you have 12 different artillery batteries, that's 48 guns. Some are 105mm howitzers located 3 miles away. Some are massive 155mm long toms located 7 miles away. Some are 8-inch heavy guns located 10 miles back. If they all fire at the exact same moment, which is the standard way of doing things, the shells from the closest guns arrive first. The enemy hears the explosions, dives for cover, and by the time the big shells arrive from 10 miles away, the target is underground. You kill a few, you scare the rest. Time on target reverses the math. The Fire Direction Center calculates the time of flight for every single gun. The 8-inch gun has a flight time of 45 seconds. The 155mm has a flight time of 30 seconds. The 105mm has a flight time of 15 seconds. To achieve a TOT, you work backward from the impact time. If you want everyone to die at exactly 12 p.m., the 8-inch gun fires at 11:59:15. 15 seconds later, the 155s fire. 15 seconds after that, the 105s fire. The result is that 75 tons of steel, travelling at supersonic speeds on different trajectories, converge on a single grid square at the exact same fraction of a second. There is no warning whistle. There is no ramp-up of intensity. One moment, you are walking through a silent forest. The next moment, the atmosphere itself detonates. This was the trap, waiting for the 277th Volksgrenadiers. Let's descend into the timeline of the disaster. December 16th, 1944. 05:30 hours. The German offensive begins with their own artillery barrage. It is heavy, but it is uncoordinated. The German logistics are already failing. Their ammo supply is limited. They are firing on a schedule, trying to preserve shells. They damage the American phone lines, but they don't destroy the command network. The 277th Volksgrenadiers surge forward out of the mist. They are attacking the positions of the American 393rd Infantry Regiment. The fighting is close, brutal, and chaotic. It's rifles, machine guns, and grenades. The Americans are outnumbered 5-1 in some sectors. They are being pushed back. The German commanders are ecstatic. The battle babies are breaking. The road to the Meuse is opening. But as the 277th pushes the Americans out of their foxholes and occupies the forward positions, they are doing exactly what the American artillery commanders wanted them to do. They are bunching up. They are coming out of the hardened bunkers and moving into the open woods. They are concentrating their forces for the final breakthrough. High on the ridge, overlooking the chaotic battlefield, are the American forward observers. These are the eyes of the machine. They are cold. They are terrified. But they are holding their microphones. They are looking at the grey masses of German infantry swarming through the tree line. The forward observer calls in the mission. He doesn't call a single battery, he calls for a serenade, a corps-level fire mission. The call goes back to the Fire Direction Center, often located in the basement of a farmhouse or the back of a specialized truck. This is a room that smells of stale coffee, cigarette smoke, and nervous sweat. But the men inside are not looking at the blood. They are looking at slide rules, firing tables, and map grids. This is the industrialization of warfare. The request is processed. Coordinates are checked. Meteorological data is applied. Wind speed, air density, temperature of the powder. This isn't guesswork. It's ballistics. The command goes out to the batteries. Time on target. Method of fire, TOT. Now, we must introduce the ghost in the machine. The secret weapon. Up until this point in the war, artillery shells had two main types of fuse. One was impact. The shell hits the ground and explodes. This is good for destroying buildings, but against infantry in a forest, it's inefficient. The shell buries itself in the mud or snow before exploding, meaning the earth absorbs most of the shrapnel. The second type was time, a mechanical timer like a kitchen timer on the nose of the shell. You guess how long the flight is, set the timer, and hope it explodes in the air above the enemy. But if your math is off by half a second, the shell explodes too high to hurt anyone or slams into the ground. The Americans at Elsenborn had something else, the Posit fuse. This was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war, second only to the atomic bomb. Inside the nose of the shell was a tiny radio transmitter and receiver. As the shell spun through the air, it emitted a radio signal. When that signal bounced off a solid object, the ground, and returned to the shell, the fuse detected the Doppler shift. When the return signal reached a certain intensity, indicating the shell was exactly 20 feet above the ground, it triggered the detonator. No timers, no guessing. It was a radar-guided execution. It meant that every single shell would airburst at the perfect lethal height, raining shrapnel downward into foxholes, trenches, and onto the heads of men lying prone. It is the afternoon of December 17th. The 277th Volksgrenadiers are preparing for a second massive wave. They are gathered in the draw, a depression in the terrain, organizing their squads. The NCOs are shouting orders. The men are checking their weapons. They believe they have local superiority. Miles away, the American gun crews are working in a rhythm that observers described as robotic. The breech blocks slam open, the brass casings are kicked out, the new shells, heavy, cold steel, are rammed home. The powder bags are loaded. The officers watch their wristwatches. Battery! Fire! The heavy 8-inch guns roar first. The ground shakes. 15 seconds later. Battery, fire. The 155s. 15 seconds later. Battery, fire. The 105s. The sky above the Ardennes is now filled with hundreds of projectiles. To the German soldiers on the ground, there is no sound yet. Just the cold wind and the distant rumble of the front. They are eating rations. They are bandaging wounds. They are looking at photos of their families. Then the math resolves itself. In a single heartbeat, the sky turns black and orange. We are not talking about a sequence of explosions. We are talking about a simultaneous overpressure event. Hundreds of shells arrive within a 2-second window. And thanks to the VT fuses, they do not hit the ground. They explode 20 feet in the air. The physics of an airburst are gruesome. When a shell hits the ground, the blast goes up and out in a cone. If you are lying down, you are safe. When a shell airbursts, the shrapnel is driven downward. There is no defilade. There is no cover. The forest itself becomes shrapnel. The pine trees are shattered, sending millions of wooden splinters flying at the velocity of bullets, mixing with the jagged steel of the shell casings. The effect on the 277th Volksgrenadier Division was not suppression. It was liquidation. A German officer captured later described the scene. He said it was as if the hand of God came down and crushed the forest. He spoke of companies where every single man was wounded or killed in the span of 3 seconds. There were no craters to hide in, because the shells weren't making craters. They were just scouring the earth. The psychological impact of a TOT strike is just as devastating as the kinetic energy. Soldiers are trained to handle stress. They are trained to time the gap between shells. They are trained to react, but you cannot react to an event that has already happened. The TOT strike removes the agency of the soldier. It tells them that their skill, their courage, and their training are irrelevant variables. Following the barrage, the American 99th Division, the battle babies, held their line. Not because they were supermen, but because there was nothing left to fight them. The German assault waves had been turned into a grim slurry of mud, pine needles, and field grey uniforms. But the machine did not stop. The Germans, desperate to break the deadlock, committed their elite armour, the 12th SS Panzer Division. These were the true believers. They drove their Panthers and Jagdpanzers toward the ridge, assuming the infantry had cleared the way. They found the roads blocked. Not by enemy barricades, but by the wreckage of their own army. The logistical thrombosis that defined the German war effort was on full display. Horse-drawn supply carts lay smashed in the road. Trucks were burning. And the American artillery was already recalculating. The forward observers shifted their grids. They began to walk the barrage backward, deeper into the German rear. They targeted the crossroads. They targeted the assembly areas. They targeted the command posts. Logistical reports from the American V Corps show that, in a 24-hour period, they fired over 10,000 rounds of heavy artillery into a sector only a few miles wide. This level of expenditure was economically impossible for the Germans. They simply could not comprehend it. They were rationing shells, counting every shot. The Americans were firing artillery to clear trees just to improve visibility. It was a collision between a cottage industry war and a mass production war. By December 18th, the 277th Volksgrenadier Division was effectively combat ineffective. They hadn't just been defeated, they had been processed. The survivors were wandering the woods in a state of catatonic shock. The 12th SS Panzer Division, unable to maneuver through the carnage and under constant fire, stalled. Elsenborn Ridge held. It was the only sector of the Battle of the Bulge where the Germans failed to advance significantly. And because the shoulder held, the roads to Liège and Antwerp stayed closed. The German fuel, so critical for their tanks, ran out. The timeline of the offensive collapsed. Now let's look at the legacy of this event. The use of the VT Fuze at Elsenborn Ridge was a crossing of the Rubicon for warfare. Before this, the proximity fuse had been restricted to anti-aircraft use over water, because the Allies were terrified that if a dud shell landed on land, the Germans would recover it, reverse engineer the vacuum tubes, and use it against Allied bombers. But General Eisenhower and the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, made a calculated risk. They released the weapon for ground use just in time for the Bulge. They gambled that the Germans were too broken, too chaotic, and too close to defeat to copy the technology in time. They were right. The missing log of Elsenborn Ridge is not found in the memoirs of the generals. It is found in the silence of the casualty lists. It is found in the fact that the 277th Division was never rebuilt. It dissolved. The cost of this victory was purely industrial. It cost dollars. It cost copper. It cost chemical propellants. But it saved the one resource the United States valued above all else: American lives. The Battle of the Bulge is often framed as a close call, and strategically it was. But tactically, at the point of contact on the northern shoulder, it was a demonstration of the terrifying disparity between the two combatants. On one side, you had an army relying on ideology, surprise, and human endurance. On the other side, you had an army that treated war as an engineering project, an army that could deliver a mathematical impossibility, 100 shells arriving at the same second, onto a single point on a map. The German soldiers believed they were fighting for the survival of their nation. The American artillerymen were solving for X. And when X equals the grid coordinates of an entire infantry division, The result is 0. This kind of history is uncomfortable. It strips away the glory. It reminds us that in the industrial age, bravery is often just a variable that can be overwhelmed by tonnage. But it is the truth. And here, we respect the truth, no matter how cold it is. The story of the 277th Volksgrenadiers and the VT Fuze is a reminder that the most dangerous weapon in war is not always the tank or the machine gun. Sometimes, it is the invisible hand of logistics and physics reaching out from a factory in Detroit to a frozen forest in Belgium. I want to know where you are listening from today. Are you an engineer, a logistician, or just someone who wants to know how the machine really works? Leave a comment below with your location and your profession. Let's build a map of our own, a grid of people who refuse to accept the simple myths. If you want to dig deeper, I recommend looking up the declassified after-action reports of the V Corps Artillery, December 1944. The numbers are all there, waiting to be read. Until next time, keep the log open.